What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sit Down. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure you hit the like button and let me know what you think in the comment section below. Also, if you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, or you're living under a rock, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button now so you never miss another Sit Down video. I also urge you, make sure you hit the notification bell so you get notified of any subsequent Sit Down videos. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to get into another Mafia topic. And in the early morning hours of October 30th, 2018, at the United States Penitentiary at Hazleton in West Virginia, the badly beaten body of Boston mobster James "Whitey" Bulger was discovered by prison officials. Bulger's body was badly beaten. He was barely recognizable. His tongue had basically been ripped out of his mouth, and his eyeballs had been gouged out of his skull. Who killed the very famous mobster? Keep in mind, only 12 hours before, he had been transferred to the institution. Was it a case of the United States government trying to cover up the many exploits of Whitey Bulger, or many inmates that wanted the famous informant dead? The feds would allege that this individual, Fotios Geas, was the killer. We're going to get into that story, and we're going to get into the life of Fotios Geas next on Sit Down Shorts. Fotios Freddie Geas was born in 1967 in West Springfield, Massachusetts. Now, the problem for Geas that he would come into contact with many years later is that his family was Greek. Now, for Geas, that is not a problem. Being Greek, he was very proud, and he would grow up with his brother Ty in Springfield. Now, for them, they would make a foray into crime very early, which we'll get to in just 1 second. But it's important to understand the landscape and lay of the land in the very popular suburb, if you will, of New York from a criminal standpoint. The American Mafia, it's particularly the Genovese family, has largely maintained a crew in Springfield really since the 20s and 30s. If we know anything, a lot of people would assume that Springfield was under New England territory. Not so fast. The Genovese family has always had a crew and a faction up in Springfield. And early on, it was actually run by an individual called Sam Kufari. Years down the road, the Genoveses have continued to operate in that area. Now, for anyone that's not aware, the American mob in Springfield maintained a wide grip on not only crime, but legit businesses as well. They ran vending, they ran strip clubs, they ran clubs in general, bars, gaming halls, all sorts of businesses were run in Springfield by that faction. And they were kicking up a lot of money to the Genovese crime family. Any good crime family needs different areas of coverage, and Springfield has always been able to maintain a very close connection with the Genovese crime family. Now, they've always had their own leader of power up there. But remember, they ultimately are a glorified captain, because in the end, are they in control? Yes, but they are kicking up and reporting to the individuals that lead the triumvirate body of the Genovese crime family. Now, for Freddie Geas, his criminal career would start very early, and he would become very important to the aura of organized crime around Springfield. Early on in his life, he very much developed a reputation that was deadly. He was known, quote, to be very prone to violent outbursts, and he would be first arrested in his early 20s after the state of Massachusetts would contend that he threatened to murder a witness in a crime. He also would be involved in various bar fights, street fights involving baseball bats, and other means of assault. Now, for him, his brother, Ty Geas, seen here on the right, would follow his brother into the world of crime. By the age of 17, Ty Geas would first get a charge. The state of Massachusetts would allege that during a fight at an ice hockey rink, Ty Geas pulled out an assault rifle and fired it. He would spend some time behind the wall, and these two developed quickly the penchant for violence. It was proven by the early 2000s and mid-2000s that the brothers were arrested in up to 75 different crimes. They were crime in Springfield, and this would get the attention of the Springfield mob. For Freddie Geas, he would first spend a long time in prison in 1996. He, alongside a cohort called Gary Westerman, would attempt to break into a freight yard and steal a tractor trailer full of electronics. He would be caught alongside Westerman, and they would both plead guilty to the crime. They'd both be given 3 to 5 years in state prison. They would head off to the big house. And this is around the time they would meet this individual, Anthony Arulata. Now, Arulata had a little bit different growing up in Springfield. He was from the south end of Springfield. He was Italian. His family ran a produce business, and he would regularly come in contact as a youth with mobsters. He would talk very openly about the fact that mobsters will come into the produce stand. They were proud Italians, his family, and he quickly saw that mobsters lived a life, and he basically wanted to be one. So Arulata, though, realized that in his life, Springfield wasn't huge, and he realized that as a young, big-time marijuana dealer, that if he could quickly rise up in the Springfield mob, he could basically become and take over the entire operation in Springfield. He had big dreams, and the Genovese family realized Arulata had big dreams. He was very capable, according to them, and what Arthur Nigro, his connection to the Genoveses in New York, he would once call Arulata a very promising individual. Now, the connections that Arulata had were big for Geas and his brother Ty. They would quickly become very useful to Arulata as he was continuing to build up his career. For Arulata, though, the connection to Arthur Nigro would become very important. Around this time in the early 2000s, the Genovese family was still adopting the front boss strategy. And in 2002, the front boss of the family, Ernie Muscarella, went to jail. By this point, the alleged boss of the Genovese crime family was Matty the Horse Aniello until 2005. But in 2002, 2003, Arthur Nigro was identified by the federal government as the front boss of the Genovese crime family. Nigro was from Port Chester in the Bronx, and he was a very respected individual. And according to many, was basically the street connection to the Genovese crime family. He would always have a pronounced connection up in Massachusetts, and he again became very chummy with Anthony Arulata. This was all good news for Ty Geas, who continued, Ty and Freddie Geas, Freddie in particular, who continued to prove important to Arulata. He was making money. He was involved in extortion, vending businesses, drug trafficking. He was making money, but his most important tool was the fact that he was willing to kill people. For Geas, his higher up, Arulata, would get his button in 2003 at a ceremony in the Bronx. And Arulata very quickly that year in 2003 would decide to take over control of the Springfield faction. By this point, the control of Springfield was in the hands of an individual called Adolfo Big Al Bruno. Bruno had been very connected in the Springfield mob really since the 50s and 60s, but he would only gain power really in 2003. Quickly, though, Arulata decided he was going to take out Bruno. He would go to Nigro, and they would kind of put together some things. But for the Springfield mob, they would have to deal with other things before the John Gotti type power grab done by Arulata. In the spring of 2003, Arthur Nigro would get into a beef with an individual called Frank DeBotto. DeBotto was a union cement boss, and he would get into a beef with DeBotto over concert tickets involving Tony Bennett. They would get into a heated argument. Nigro decides, fuck this guy, I want him dead. So he goes to Arulata and says, you need to take out this DeBotto guy. You can find him in the Bronx right here. Arulata, alongside Freddie and Ty Geas, would stalk DeBotto to a home in the Bronx. They would catch him outside of his home and shoot him 9 times. The problem for Arulata and the Geas brothers was DeBotto didn't die. And in fact, Nigro would lament to Arulata that your assassins need to be better at shooting people in the head. DeBotto would ultimately survive. But this would not be the last time Freddie Geas and his brother would be called upon to do a hit. in November of 2003, their old friend Gary Westerman needed to be killed. According to Aralata, he would contend in interviews later that Gary Westerman not only was a rival drug dealer, but he was dating Aralata's sister-in-law. She was 30 years his junior. Aralata told him multiple times to stay away from the woman. She was a drug addict, and he continued to funnel her drugs, and they just weren't happy with the relationship. So Westerman was told by Aralata, stay away. They would ultimately find out that Westerman was an informant, and he would be killed as well. On November 4th, 2003, Freddie Geas, alongside his brother Ty and Anthony Aralata, would kill Gary Westerman. They would shoot him multiple times. And initially, Aralata would say that Westerman would not die. At that point, he, alongside another cohort, grabbed a shovel and beat Westerman to death. They would throw him into a shallow grave in Agawam, Massachusetts. Now, Geas continued to provide very important. He would, though, be called on, Geas, to kill their most important target just 3 weeks later. By this point, not only did Arthur Nigro become tired of the alleged leader of Springfield, Big Al Bruno, but Aralata looked at it as a power grab, and he would create that mini John Gotti type of power grab. He would go to Nigro and say, basically, look, this guy isn't making any money, and we have important news that he's an informant. According to Aralata, he would say that Nigro was told that Big Al Bruno was giving info to the feds for a couple of years and they needed to go. Nigro would instruct an individual, Felix Tranguese, to give the okay to Aralata and to put it into motion. Aralata would then go to Freddie Geas and tell Geas to hit Big Al Bruno. Now, the Aralata faction had realized that Big Al Bruno was very much a card player, and every Saturday night he would go to the Mount Carmel Society Social Club and play Italian card games. They had decided that at that point that was a good time to hit him. Now, Geas decided that he was too high profile and Big Al Bruno knew him, so he farmed the hit out to an old prison buddy called Frank Roche. On the evening of November 23rd, 2003, Roche would catch Big Al Bruno as he walked out of the social club and shot him 6 times. At that point, Mr. Roche was paid $10,000 and told to leave town. He would flee Massachusetts. Ultimately, for the Geas brothers, they would continue to earn. In fact, at one point, Geas was involved in very high-level extortions. They were making a lot of money through vending, produce, all sorts of things. At one point in 2006, Freddie Geas would actually go to prison after he beat 2 men with a baseball bat. It would all come to a head, though, in late 2009. At that point, in early 2010, the federal government would display a wide-ranging federal indictment involving not only Freddie Geas, his brother Ty, Anthony Aralata, and Arthur Nigro. They would all be indicted and involved in multiple murders. This was a bad time for the new leaders of the Springfield mob. For Aralata, though, he had maintained some power for a long time. Ultimately, though, as I said, anyone that had power in Springfield, so the boss of Springfield, was never truly the boss. They had always reported to someone as a higher up, being a faction of the family. For Geas, his brother, and Arthur Nigro, they would face not one but multiple raps. Frank Roche would ultimately cooperate, and the chief cooperator in this case was Anthony Aralata. He would tell Vlad TV many years later that he decided, and facing the death penalty in these cases, his family to him was more important than his mob family. Now, I will ask Mr. Aralata as to why he didn't have that coagulation early in his career as opposed to when he was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. But maybe we'll get to ask him that at some point. In 2011, after damning testimony from Aralata, all the defendants in this case were found guilty, including Arthur Nigro, Freddie and Ty Geas, and other individuals in this indictment. They would all be convicted in not only the killing of Gary Westerman, the individual Al Bruno, as well as the attempted hit on the Bronx cement boss, Arthur D'Abato, as well as other crimes, including extortion and things of that nature. Arthur Nigro was sentenced to life in prison and died in 2019 at the age of 74 years old. Ty Geas, seen on the right, was also given a life sentence and is currently serving his time at USP McCreary in Pine Knot, Kentucky. The subject of this case, Freddie Geas, was also given a life sentence. He would ultimately head to USP Hazleton and serve his time. We would not hear much about Freddie Geas outside of a couple letters where he would maintain his witty and funny known character and things of that nature. But I want to talk quickly about the trial involving these three individuals, and Nigro and the Geas brothers. A former marshal for the federal government would talk openly about the manner of the two brothers. He would talk about at length that, quote, Freddie was extremely well-mannered. Every morning, this marshal would pick up Freddie, Ty, and Nigro from custody. He always would mention that Freddie Geas would walk out of the cell first, which showed him a lot of power, that he was maybe kind of the leader in weird retrospect, because Nigro was actually the boss of the family. He would also talk openly that Geas would offer him every morning a tin of Altoids, and he always maintained a very calm demeanor. He would talk as well about Ty Geas and that he was the complete opposite of his brother. And at one point, Ty Geas became enraged that the judge in the case would pronounce their last name as Geas. According to Ty Geas, he would become insane and at one point would scold his lawyer about the fact that it was not the right name and they needed to fix it, and that, quote, Ty was nuts. He would also tell this same marshal that at one point, the reason Arulata would cooperate was because Ty Geas allegedly was carrying on an extramarital affair with Arulata's wife, supposedly, and that she enjoyed a lot of sexual proclivities. Now, I'm not saying that was factual. That's what Ty Geas was ultimately joking about with the marshal and the co-defendants in this case. Now, I want to talk about really where we are today. Ty Geas, again, as I said, is in prison as well, but Freddie Geas would not turn up until 2018. On October 29th, 2018, the Federal Bureau of Prisons would transfer 89-year-old James Whitey Bulger, a Boston mobster. We don't need to go into his story. Many know his story. He was a mobster, but also a mob informant. He was transferred to the very volatile USP Hazleton. Remember, it is one of the most secure, violent prisons on the face of the planet, and in no way should an individual to the age of Whitey Bulger been transferred to that institution. Now, they would say, the Bureau of Prisons, that he was transferred due to disciplinary problems in other prisons. Not 12 hours later, on the early morning hours of October 30th, his badly beaten, disfigured, tongue ripped out, eyes ripped out body would be discovered in his cell at 8:20 a.m. Now, according to the federal government, they would say that they had prison tapes where it showed Freddie Geas and another individual walk into the cell and take out Whitey Bulger with a lock and a sock. According to them, they would also say that the individual involved in the case, Freddie Geas, was known to hate rats, and that was the reason he took out Bulger. There was another co-defendant in this case that also was from New England that was said to be involved in this case as well. To this day, it's important to understand that neither his co-defendant nor Freddie Geas has been charged in this murder, and they remain in the SHU. Okay? Specialized housing, basically solitary. 4 years later, almost, Freddie Geas has not been charged with a crime. It's important to understand that is against rules of cruel and unusual punishment. I am very aware that Freddie Geas is a convicted murderer. That does not mean that the Bureau of Prisons can get off scot-free and treat an individual who they have not charged with this crime to continue to remain in federal prison custody. According to the family of Fotios Geas, his son Alex would say, quote, he doesn't get any sort of mail. They treat him very poorly. They don't give him food at times. He doesn't get prison calls or anything. I guess we'll ask the federal government and Bureau of Prisons why they have not charged him with a crime. And if they're not going to charge him with the crime, they should release him back to prison custody. In my opinion, this definitely seems kind of perfect that this all kind of figured it out. How quickly did these inmates find out? Now, it's important to also mention that in this prison intake that they did with Whitey Bulger, on the intake screening form, Whitey Bulger was asked two questions. Do you know of any reason you should not be assigned a population, or have you assisted law enforcement agents in any way? Both questions were checked no. But as we know, this probably should have been done by the upper echelon of the BOP. This was not handled correctly, and it would not surprise me if years down the road we find out that James Whitey Bulger was probably coerced, and his family would ultimately sue the Bureau of Prisons for this murder. To this day, as I said, Fotios Geas remains in solitary confinement and will do life in prison regardless of what happens. The only question is, will it be on death row or will it be in general population? I guess we'll have to wait and see. This continues to be a hotbed issue. As always, if you enjoy this video and like what I'm doing, please do me a favor. All I ask is that you hit the like and subscribe button. We'll see you next time.